I was 23 years old, attending a costume gathering at the residence of my former closest companion, Alex. He tragically passed away from an opiate overdose in 2015. Before his death, he had a tradition of hosting elaborate Halloween parties annually at his place, as his parents typically traveled to a different city each year for their own friend's event. Alex was always a huge fan of the holiday, so the entire dwelling was adorned with unsettling decorations that we all knew he had invested heavily in. He even constructed large sections of cardboard barriers and covered them with wall coverings to fashion a spooky labyrinth of sorts. I want to keep this narrative relatively mild, so I'll bypass recounting the details concerning cannabis, spirits, psychedelics, and intimate activities, and move directly to when things took a turn for the worse. I'll admit we weren't fully rational at the time. None of us were. Anyone who had been to Alex's parties was aware of the usual happenings. Myself, Alex, and a few other guys, Marco, Chris, and Ben, were on the upper level in Alex's chamber sharing a pipe when we detected two distinct heavy impacts emanating from the floor below. Alex, awkwardly yet fearful, hurried to open the door and investigate. There were sounds of shrieking from both men and women. I recall vividly it sounded as if a multitude of terrified voices were crying out for their lives down there. We all urged Alex to return inside and secure the latch. Even in our altered state, we all knew what was transpiring. Alex darted back inside and closed the door swiftly yet softly, securing it behind him. He faced us with a look on his face like someone who had just seen something terrible. "What did you see? What's going on?" we all demanded of him. Before anything else, he told us to conceal ourselves. From then on, we refrained from querying. Alex extinguished the illumination and hid in the closet with Chris, while I concealed myself under the bed with Ben, and Marco hid in a storage chest. We could hear the blaring tunes from below cease, succeeded by an adult male yelling at everyone to be silent. One distressed young woman emitted a shriek of alarm, followed by another impact and then stillness. The man resumed yelling at everyone, but for my part I struggled to distinguish the words, and I definitely could not recall precisely what he was shouting. We discerned the voices of two additional men shouting by now. There was a verified presence of 3 trespassers in the house, though potentially more as far as we were aware then. We detected heavy footsteps ascending the staircase and then reaching the midpoint of the corridor, halting just beyond the room's entrance. The trespasser on the other side of the door attempted to turn the handle, but when he found it secured, he began striking forcefully at the door, presumably with his shoulder. After a few unsuccessful efforts at that, the report of several shots fired at the door handle was sufficient to disable the mechanism permitting entry. We overheard cries from below after the shots to the handle, succeeded by quiet and a firearm discharge. My hands were clamped over my mouth to muffle our respiration. I observed via the sheer fabric draped below the bottom of Alex's bed as dark footwear with tattered overhanging trousers gravitated purposefully towards the closet. He swung it open. I overheard Alex pleading for the trespasser to spare his life, proposing a substantial sum in exchange for their departure. Alex identified himself as the resident. That's when the trespasser directed him to the lower level. The remaining individuals stayed concealed, Evidently, Chris hadn't been apprehended with Alex. We remained beneath the bed, trembling with fear. There was almost complete quiet from below, apart from Alex conversing with the trespassers, but their exchange was too hushed for us to overhear. It seemed like almost 20 minutes before the main entry closed forcefully and Alex came hurrying back up to announce their departure. I think the most terrifying instant I've ever experienced was when I descended back into the main reception area and beheld the two lifeless forms stretched out on the floor, wounds to their heads discharging blood. Sarah and Mike, two dear friends whose absence I still feel keenly. I'll omit the specifics of the events that transpired upon the authorities' arrival. But notwithstanding the distinct aroma of cannabis, the authorities prioritized identifying the concealed perpetrators who ended the lives of two young individuals. Oh yes. Alex informed the four of us who were sequestered in his chamber that there were 4 trespassers altogether, all sporting felt hats, anonymous masks, outerwear, and hand coverings. They requested 100,000 units of currency in immediate funds, and when Alex was unable to supply this, they insisted he fill their unoccupied bag with his most cherished belongings. The attendees held captive in the room were also compelled to relinquish their wallets as well into the container, to be later targeted with gunfire. After the occurrence, Alex fell into a state of melancholy. He began consuming excessive alcohol, developing a dependence. He ceased attending educational sessions and eventually abandoned his studies entirely. He commenced using more potent substances like stimulants and opiates. I shared one meaningful conversation with him since that night, and he was more candid during this discussion than ever before. He confided in me with moisture tracking his face and a smoking device clutched, that he endured perpetual anguish, convinced he was responsible for the demise of 2 close companions. Alex succumbed to an opiate overdose in the summer of 2015, less than 12 months after the occurrence. It was my first Halloween living in my own residence, separate from my parents. I reside in a modest corner property with a basement but no upper level, a house my parents contributed half the cost for. It was 11 at night. I was seated in the main reception area watching frightening holiday films when I found myself rising to answer a knock at the main entrance. But then I paused and contemplated who could be at the door at 11 p.m. Surely there were no more children collecting treats. I had a pretty strong inclination it was a late-night holiday prankster, so I waited a moment. Then I glanced at the porch through the window. They were already gone. Yes, pranksters. I sat back down, not giving it a second thought, and again knocking at the main entrance. "Get lost!" I yelled. I was not in the mood for troublesome adolescents. They disregarded my demands and started pounding now, not just knocking. I was irritated now. I leaped up and swung the door open. No one was there. Once again, I slipped on my footwear and headed outside to begin inspecting the hedges for the kids, but there was nobody in sight. Not in the hedges, not behind my car, not across the road. I was finished answering. I didn't want to contribute to their amusement anymore, so I went back inside, double-locked the main entrance, and went to my sleeping quarters, securing that door as well, just to feel more secure, I suppose. Even over the television, I could still hear the bothersome kids pounding on my main entrance repeatedly. I was so close to contacting the authorities to get them away, but that would undoubtedly result in my property being vandalized with food or paper. The pounding persisted for an uncomfortably extended period, more than half an hour. I thought these adolescents must be recording something for online viewing and were desperate for a reaction, but I wasn't going to give it to them. At some point, I dozed off with the television on, only to awaken to the knocking again. I looked at the time. It was 2 a.m. How could those children still be at it, I thought. I turned the television off and sat up with my ears open for a few moments. My heart completely stopped as I realized the knocking was not at my main entrance, but rather at my bedroom door. I jumped out of bed, looking around my room like a madman for something to use as a defensive object. They knew I was awake now. They were attempting the door handle, trying to force entry. These weren't any children. By some stroke of fortune, I came up with an idea. It was a long shot, but it was all I could conceive of. I turned on the receiver to my sound system, connected my mobile device, brought up the video application, typed in firearm discharge sound effect, turned up the amplification, and pressed play. The report of a firearm echoed out of the speakers. It sounded realistic enough. I paused the video after the first shot and yelled, "That was a preliminary discharge. Depart now, or I won't hesitate to shoot you in the head." And it worked. I heard 2 pairs of footsteps thumping over my wooden floors and out the main entrance. I allowed a moment before opening my bedroom door and peeking outside. They were gone, but the main entrance was left wide open. I quickly secured it, contacted the authorities, and that's where my narrative concluded. So I was never truly a significant enthusiast of Halloween. Primarily because I grew up without many companions, and once I surpassed the age of 10, I couldn't use the excuse of accompanying my mother anymore, and it's not like I had friends to go with. So this last Halloween, I was 15 years old. I do have a younger sibling who's only 8, so my mother went collecting treats with her. My one really good friend, Mark, already had other arrangements, and I didn't want to intrude, so it didn't seem like I'd be participating this year. I felt a tiny part of me internally burst with delight when my mother asked me to remain at home and distribute sweets. Now I felt like I had a task to perform that didn't involve me collecting treats alone like a failure. My mother left with my sister at about 6 roughly an hour after she arrived home from her job. She told me to anticipate her return around 9 o'clock, so I was relaxing on the sofa in the main reception area, watching the frightening film marathon on a specific channel and occasionally answering the door to provide candy to the young ones. While doing that, the hallway phone began to ring. I remember the ringer was set so loudly it actually made me startle. I picked up the phone, and the other end remained silent, except for a bit of fumbling and ambient noises, sounds you'd anticipate when someone's holding a phone. I think I said hello about 5 times before the person on the other end terminated the call. I just knew it was somebody performing a Halloween prank call on me. What else could I do but ignore it? That worked well enough for the next few minutes of viewing television, answering the door until the phone rang again. Same unidentified number appearing on the caller identification. I wanted to see where this was headed, so I picked it up once more. This time I could hear a very faint breathing on the other end. "All right, Mark, I know it's you," I said into the phone. They hung up. By this point, I didn't want to say I was scared, but I was for sure a bit uneasy. It was a long time before that phone rang again. It was getting later, darker, and the doorbell seemed to be ringing less and less. I was watching the initial part of a classic horror series when it occurred again. The sound of that phone ringing had become sickening as I knew who it would be, or rather I didn't. For some reason I gave in again and picked up, and once again silence. Other than the faint breathing and fumbling of the phone. It was like this for almost half a minute before they finally spoke in an exaggerated deep voice. "I'll be paying you a visit tonight." I had enough of this joke. I told them to get lost and terminate the call, promising myself not to pick it up again. I'd say about half an hour later, out of the blue, all the electrical power in the house was disconnected. The lights went out, the television turned off. Complete darkness. I stood up, now frozen in fear, when loud and angry thumping came from the main entrance. I completely lost control and began shrieking like a girl, but there was something coming from outside. Laughter. I recognized that laughter. I opened the door, and there he was, Stephen. I shoved him nearly down the steps out of anger. "So that was you who made those dumb phone calls?" I asked. He nodded while laughing. "You didn't sound like you on the phone. Let me hear you do that voice again," I said. "What?" He seemed confused. "I didn't say anything, you idiot. I just called and did that heavy breathing." I thought he was lying at first, but then my heart dropped. I had him follow me to the fuse box outside. Just as I feared, it had been opened and all the connections had been severed. I think we ran faster than any competitive sprinters back into the house. I called my mother, who told us to stay inside and wait for the police, whom she then contacted. The call was traced to a public telephone kiosk outside of a nearby establishment. I still wonder, was this just a foolish Halloween prank that escalated too far? Or was it a potential unauthorized entry and God knows what else waiting to transpire? I don't think I ever want to discover the truth. When I was younger, my companions and I went collecting treats every year. One particular year, as we were engaged in this activity, we passed a gentleman who stood motionless with a mask on, holding a cane. As we walked past him, he rotated his entire body around and followed us with his gaze. We were unsettled, but there were plenty of individuals around, so we proceeded to the next property. My companions and I saw him repeatedly as we moved from house to house, and he seemed to be trailing us. In typical suspense story form, we walked so slowly we couldn't comprehend how he kept pace with us. At one house, when we hadn't seen him for a while, we received our candy. As we turned around to walk back to the street, the masked gentleman stood in the road waiting for us. Immediately, we knocked back on the door and informed the residents of the property about it. The masked gentleman continued walking down the street, and we didn't see him again that evening. Later on, an adult associate of the family told us he saw a masked figure hiding behind a shrubbery, beckoning little children over, and he only retreated when the associate threatened to summon the authorities. I was collecting treats with my friend Chloe. We were both 10 years old at the time. We were walking across a small footbridge over a narrow waterway that many refer to as the Jack Winkle Stream when a dark truck pulled up on the other side of the bridge, essentially obstructing our path. We turned around and hurried away. We were the types of kids to adhere to the principles of stranger danger. We could hear the windows of the truck lowering, and a man with a rough smoker's voice called for us to return. He was yelling for assistance, asking us for directions. I yelled sorry, and we continued to hurry away. The truck couldn't fit over that small bridge, so it pulled away and drove down the road on the other side. We thought we had made our escape from the unsettling driver when here came a different vehicle barreling around the corner and down the street, slamming on the brakes in front of us. Once again, the driver rolled down the windows. Now, with them right next to us, we could see there were 2 additional occupants in the vehicle as well. An older gentleman with a receding hairline and a beard in the rear seat, who also had a rough smoker's voice, told us to get in the vehicle, that they had complimentary bags of sweets. The truck performed a 3-point turn and tailed us wherever we went. At one point, the truck finally accelerated past us, came to a stop, and the rear and front passenger side doors opened, and the 2 unsettling men stepped out, lunging at us. We dropped our bags of candy and ran straight for my house, which was now visible. We rang the doorbell desperately at least 20 times. The older men that were pursuing us couldn't run fast, and when they saw us running to my house, they turned back. My mother opened the door, and we screamed and pointed at the truck that was backing away in the other direction. She shoved us inside and locked the door and contacted the authorities, as any parent would. She reported the dark truck with 3 men inside, older looking with rough voices and any other descriptions we gave. My mother was extremely worried all night, distressed about the fact that they now knew where we resided. My father tried to calm her, but she couldn't relax. Ultimately, the authorities agreed to send an unmarked police vehicle to remain outside and keep watch for about 3 hours. That made my mother feel slightly better. But what made us all feel better was when my father woke us up to see the flashing red and blue lights outside of the unmarked police vehicle. They had pulled over a vehicle and a dark truck, and 3 men were in restraints. The 3 old individuals who attempted to abduct me and Chloe. My father went outside to converse with the officer and most likely confirmed that those were the men. Me and Chloe went to the entranceway and yelled at the men to get their attention. They looked, and we both gave them a dismissive gesture. My mother then pulled us back in and shut the door, sending us to bed. It went from potentially the worst night of both of our lives to ultimately the best night of our lives. This narrative took place on Halloween night. I took my 6-year-old daughter Lily collecting treats for a few hours, and when we returned, I prepared dinner. We watched television together, and then I sent her to bed. I was feeling particularly fatigued that night, so I cleaned up and went to sleep shortly after. My daughter entered the room and informed me there was someone in her closet. I assured her there was no one in her closet. She wanted to sleep with me, but I once again assured her that she was secure in her room. She reluctantly went back to her room and shut the door. I made a mental note that if she came back again, I would walk her to her closet and demonstrate to her that there's no one in there. Surely enough, 5 minutes later, she came back. I asked her why she thought there was someone in her closet. She responded saying she heard someone moving around and things falling over. Honestly, when she said that, it kind of made my heart skip a beat for a second. I walked her to her room and turned on the lights. I jokingly asked, "Is anybody in there?" We stood and listened. I didn't expect to hear anything. There it was, a thud from inside the closet. I screamed at Lily to run to the neighbors and contact the authorities. As she did, I swung the door open and was shocked to find the neighbor's son, Tom, sitting on top of my daughter's toy chest. I grabbed him by the collar of his garment and yanked him up aggressively. I walked him angrily back to his parents' house next door and found Lily ringing the doorbell. When they answered, I shoved him inside right into his father and explained everything. I told him I wouldn't pursue legal action, but if I ever caught him near my daughter again, they would all face consequences. Tom's dad, Mr. Davies, struck him across the face, then asked me to come inside to allow Tom to explain himself. Me and Lily both went inside. Apparently, while I was taking Lily collecting treats, he had snuck into our house through an unlatched window and hid in her closet with his friend Kevin. I asked him if this Kevin kid was still in my house. He said yes. I told Lily to wait with Mr. Davies while I ran back into my house, and right as I entered, there he was. This Kevin kid, less attractive and shadier looking than Tom. He had my daughter's undergarments in his hand. What I did next was completely out of fatherly protective fury. I grabbed the little punk by the throat and threw him to the floor, striking him a few times in the face, then hesitantly allowing him to get up and leave. The only reason I didn't contact the authorities was because of my close relationship with Mr. Davies, but I made my point very strongly that if they ever so much as waved to my daughter again, they would be the subject of media attention the next day. We went back to sleep. I let Lily sleep with me after that incident. She was terrified. The next morning I discovered a small hole in her closet door. The sick little perverts were observing my daughter while she slept, at the same time interacting with her undergarments. Perhaps you don't grasp the horror of the story unless you are a parent, but there are many days where I think I made a mistake not contacting the authorities. I still could, but nothing has happened since, and I figure I shouldn't create more disturbance now. Jim is 13 now, and that unpleasant Tom has since gone away to higher education. We had just moved into our large new residence in Brampton, Ontario, in an area called Sandalwood. It was Halloween night, and my parents, my 3 other sisters, my brother, and I were unpacking our belongings in our new sleeping quarters. We had just finished and were discussing leaving our old educational institutions and companions behind. My mother called us to perform tasks. I was truly weary since it was 11:30 at night. Well past the excitement of collecting treats, and we had to do chores now. It seemed to take an eternity, but when I was finished, I decided to go to my bedroom and get some rest. I heard what sounded like creaks in the upstairs hallway. Thinking it was my brother or sister, I got up to call out to them for disturbing me while I was sleeping. But as far as I could tell, there was no one there. I rushed down to the basement where my parents, sister, and brother were considerately working. I asked them all if they had been upstairs, and they replied no. Now I was getting pretty unnerved, but I had to believe it was just my imagination and shrugged it off as if it had never happened. I went back to my bed, which was now extremely cold. I had to put on a sweater. It was just too chilly. I woke up in the middle of the night around 12:30 a.m. after everyone had gone to sleep. I heard this loud banging sound that seemed to be coming from another room upstairs. I thought it might be my brother or sister waiting to get a drink of water, but was too scared to go alone. I was wrong. The banging continued, getting louder by the minute. I couldn't get to sleep, so I decided to investigate. I walked into the hallway, and believe me, there was no one there. As I walked in, the banging seemed to stop. I stared at the door only for a quick moment before deciding to go back to bed. After a couple of minutes, the banging started again. Now I was totally chilled to my very core. I tried to sleep again, but I couldn't. Very typical of me. The door to my bedroom creaked open as if someone were pushing it lightly, but it was too dark to see who or what could have been causing it. "Hey, what the heck are you doing? Who is it? Let me go back to sleep." Very light footsteps began to move closer to my bed. I thought it was one of my sisters until I turned onto my side after the footsteps stopped and saw a figure standing next to my bed, a figure at least unusually tall. I choked the urge to scream. Nothing came out. I lay there in unimaginable horror as the figure finally said, "Boo." That was when I screamed at the top of my lungs and covered my eyes. When my parents thrust open the door to my room and flicked on the light, there was no figure there. There was no figure by my bed. I cried out everything to them, the thumping, the figures. My siblings came into the doorway and watched me freak out. I asked my parents if they heard the knocking on their door. Surely they must have. It was their door after all. But they said there was no knocking, not that they knew of. They all looked at me like I was crazy, but I know I'm not. You can't just imagine something like that, something so real. I'll never forget this night. I know I won't. It was a few years ago, Halloween night. We were all 20 years old, right at that age where visiting haunted attractions is one of the best activities on Halloween. The attraction was called Terror Trail Descent, or something similar. It was only operational for 4 consecutive years in our town. It was never mentioned again. This was its 4th and final year. It was a very high quality and surprisingly scary haunted house, one of the best ones I've been to. This was not a tour-guided attraction. It was a group exploration attraction. Basically a labyrinth where the only way out was to navigate your way to the basement, locate one of the access items, then find the exit and use the item you found to release the door. It was a very distinctive haunted house, that's for sure. Unfortunately, it wasn't a pleasant evening for us, and you're about to learn why. We started out in the main reception area of the house. To give as much detail as I can about the room, there was a giant open coffin sitting right smack in the middle of the room. There were very convincing spider webs covering just about every inch of every corner of the room. All the furniture was antique and dusty looking, and of course blood was stained on the creaky wooden floor. We could tell right away this haunted house was going to be excellent. The next room was the dining area. That was where things got unsettling. The rooms following the dining area were all very dimly lit by artificial lamps attached to the walls. On several occasions, actors jumped out at us in horrifically convincing costumes as expected, and yet they still startled me every time. We actually spent a lot of time going in circles trying to find the basement. This wasn't a truly wide-open house. It was designed to be like a labyrinth with many rooms and false doors. It took a long time for us to finally find the basement entrance, and I have to admit I was nervous to go down there. It was completely pitch black down there. We started to think that it might have been an employees-only area where they stored props. It was just too dark down there to perceive anything. It was stated many times that no mobile devices were permitted while in the attraction, so we couldn't use phone screens as lights. If we wanted to get out of there, we had no choice but to go down there. Each step created a creak, more painful to the ears than fingernails scratching on a blackboard. We were all laughing, telling each other how terrified we were. I had my hands out in front of me as if I was searching for anything in the complete darkness. I bumped into somebody and apologized. "Who was that?" I asked, expecting it to be one of my friends. No answer. Whoever I just bumped into placed their hand on my shoulder, and I took off running and screaming while at the same time laughing. There was something so disturbing about being in that huge pitch-black basement, knowing someone was in there with us. One of my friends thankfully located an access item on a shelf in the corner of the room. We all ran back upstairs, back to the light, and found the departure door. The actual experience and process of getting through that labyrinth of a haunted house was much longer than my narrative makes it out to be. But that's not where the things got horrifying. Right outside the departure door was a small container with a sign that said, "Deposit access items here, please." That's how the staff would collect the items and bring them back down to the basement. Halfway off the premises of the haunted house, the departure door opened, and a really tall person dressed in a black robe and bloody clown mask stepped out and started following in our direction. He or she, though it was most likely a he, so I'll refer to them as a he, appeared to be one of the staff members for the attraction. As we walked further away from the attraction, so did the individual in the costume. It seemed to all of us that he was following us. By this point, one of my friends called out, "We don't have the item if that's what you want. We dropped it in the little container." But that didn't do the trick. As a joke, we started running just to see if he would too, and he did. We stopped, and so did he. We stood still, and so did he. At first it was funny, maybe it was just a joke, but as we got closer to my friend Sam's house, we were starting to discuss if we should reveal where he lives to this person. He had been following us for at least 5 blocks now, so if it was a joke, it had gone far enough. Sam's parents were both home, so we felt safe to go inside. Apparently, Sam's back gate was stuck or something like that, so we had to go back around. We jokingly waved at the persistent individual still following us and walked to Sam's backyard, shutting the gate behind us, wiping our feet on his welcome mat on the back door. We heard the gate open. The man emerged from behind the side of the house and began walking towards us once again, this time much faster. Sam opened the back door and called to his dad, telling him to retrieve his firearm. This seemed to grab the masked man's attention. He slowed down, turned his head to face Sam. Sam's dad emerged, visibly angered, and aimed his pistol at the masked figure. He raised his hands up and cried out for him not to shoot, that he's only 30. Sam's dad told him to get lost and never come back, and the next time, he wouldn't think twice about pulling the trigger. Personally, I wish Sam's dad had made the guy get on his knees and remove the mask, then contacted the authorities. That individual got off too easily. For all we know, he could have been armed as well. We contacted the haunted house attraction and they informed us that they had no such employee dressed in a clown mask.